I'm reading from Revelation 21, verses 10 through 27 in the New Living Translation. So he took me in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and he showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God and sparkled like a precious stone, like jasper, as clear as crystal. The city wall was broad and high, with 12 gates guarded by 12 angels, and the names of the 12 tribes of Israel were written on the gates. There were 3 gates on each side, east, north, south, and west. The wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were written the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who talked to me held in his hand a gold measuring stick to measure the city, its gates, and its wall. When he measured it, he found it was a square, as wide as it was long. In fact, its length and width and height were each 1,400 miles. Then he measured the walls and found them to be 216 feet thick, according to the human standard used by the angel. The wall was made of jasper, and the city was pure gold, as clear as glass. The wall of the city was built on foundation stones, inlaid with 12 precious stones. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. The 12 gates were made of pearls, each gate from a single pearl, and the main street was pure gold, as clear as glass. I saw no temple in the city, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb is its light. The nations will walk in its light, and the kings of the world will enter the city in all their glory. Its gates will never be closed at the end of day, because there is no night there. And all the nations will bring their glory and honor into the city. Nothing evil will be allowed to enter, nor anyone who practices shameful idolatry and dishonesty, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. This is the word of the Lord.
There's a reason we're talking about this text today. With our youth at youth retreat, several adult volunteers, and with our children out in WOW today. There are some texts in the Bible that aren't rated G. Today is one of those texts. And so I hope we'll think together as adults as we think on a tale of 2 cities. Our second scripture reading is from Revelation 17, verses 1 to 14. And I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. One of the 7 angels who had poured out the 7 bowls came over and spoke to me. "Come with me," he said, "and I will show you the judgment that is going to come on the great prostitute who rules over many waters. The kings of the world have committed adultery with her, and the people who belong to this world have been made drunk by the wine of her immorality." So the angel took me in the Spirit into the wilderness, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and blasphemies against God were written all over it. The woman wore purple and scarlet clothing, beautiful jewelry made of gold and precious gems and pearls. In her hand she held a gold goblet full of obscenities and the impurities of her immorality. A mysterious name was written on her forehead: Babylon the Great, mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. I could see that she was drunk with the blood of God's holy people who were witnesses for Jesus. I stared at her in complete amazement. "Why are you so amazed?" the angel asked. "I will tell you the mystery of this woman and the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns on which she sits. The beast you saw was once alive but isn't now. And yet he will soon come out of the bottomless pit and go to eternal destruction. And the people who belong to this world, whose names were not written in the book of life before the world was made, will be amazed at the reappearance of this beast who has died. This calls for a mind with understanding. The 7 heads of the beast represent 7 hills where the woman rules. They also represent 7 kings. 5 kings have already fallen. The 6th now reigns, and the 7th is yet to come, but his reign will be brief. The scarlet beast that was, but is no longer, is the 8th king. He is like the other 7, and he too is headed for destruction. The 10 horns of the beast are 10 kings who have not yet risen to power. They will be appointed to their kingdoms for one brief moment to reign with the beast. They will all agree to give him their power and authority. Together, they will go to war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will defeat them because he is Lord of lords and King of all kings. And his called and chosen and faithful ones will be with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Of 2 cities. You know, each and every major city in the world today and throughout time has a certain spirit that defines it. The life of a city is more than its geography. My favorite sociologist, now a late sociologist, his name is Neil Postman. He wrote several years ago that different U.S. cities define the spirit of different ages in American history. For example, he writes that the city of Boston was the face of 18th century America. The political radicalism which enlivened colonial America was alive and well in the great city of Boston. And in the mid-19th century, with immigration at its height, the melting pot of New York City was the paradigm of the age, hosting immigrants from all over the world. In the early 20th century, with the rise of industrialism, Postman says that Chicago embodied the age, became the face of America, with its blue-collar work ethic, its industrial work ethic. And today, Postman says that Las Vegas has captured the spirit of America. Saturated on rampant entertainment and fun at all costs. You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You get the idea. Cities are more than dots on a map. Cities are more than geographic points. Each city embodies a spirit, an ideology about it. I was reminded of this a few years ago when I was living in Oklahoma City and I was driving down the road and I noticed a bumper sticker on the car in front of me which read, "Don't Edmund my Norman." Don't Edmund my Norman. Edmond is a suburb on the northern side of Oklahoma City, a well-to-do suburb where the richest of people live in the Oklahoma City metro area. Norman is a suburb sort of south of Oklahoma City where the University of Oklahoma is. Kind of an artsy place. Someone said, "Don't Edmund my Norman." And while I don't completely understand what that means, I'm pretty sure they weren't talking about relocation. Every city incarnates a certain way of life, a spirit. Revelation is a book about cities. In fact, the book is addressed to 7 cities throughout Asia Minor. But we must be careful not to mistake what it was like in the cities of the ancient world and collapse the distance between them and what it's like to live in cities today. It was quite different. Life in the ancient cities was a hard life, a very hard life. I would recommend a book to you today by Rodney Stark, a biblical scholar, called The Rise of Christianity. Stark writes about what life was like in ancient cities. He reminds us that ancient cities couldn't sprawl and sprawl and sprawl like modern cities can. They were walled for their own protection. And so you had a limited amount of space. You had a limited amount of ground for these cities. You had a high density of people living in close proximity with one another. Based on archaeological evidence, Stark estimates that the ancient city of Antioch had 117 people per acre. Let's think about that. 117 people per acre. When you compare that with modern-day cities like Chicago, which has 21 people per acre, or San Francisco, which has 23 people per acre, or New York City, which has 37 people per acre. Antioch had 117. And that doesn't count the fact that none of the residents in ancient cities lived in high sky-rises like modern cities. And people in modern cities don't have to share their space with their livestock. Can you imagine? Privacy is a modern-day invention. It's estimated that the average Roman road in the ancient world was 9.5 feet wide. You lived 9.5 feet away from your neighbor. There was no such thing as privacy in the ancient world. There was no indoor plumbing. And so you had to go to the public fountain for bathing or to retrieve water for your home. And of course, you had to be very judicious about the use of your water. And without plumbing, you had a myriad of sanitation issues, closely followed by insect invasions, all resulting in a quick spread of disease. You know the history of disease. Ancient cities were melting pots of diverse cultures, only the diverse cultures didn't melt. They were just there together and they often collided. There was often ethnic conflict in ancient cities. Natural disasters were common, like earthquakes, and social disasters were common, like mob violence, both of which created other social issues like poverty and disease. Life in the ancient city was a hard life, full of misery and danger and despair and hatred. And for all of these reasons and more which I haven't named, life in the ancient city was very, very, very difficult. And it's to people who are living in these kinds of cities that the book of Revelation is written. In the last few chapters of the book, chapters 17 to 22, two cities dominate the landscape. Both of these cities are compared to women, are analogous to women. Babylon, who is called a prostitute, or more literally, a whore, and the New Jerusalem, who is called a bride. What John is talking about, though, isn't so much these places as cities, but these places as ways of life. For example, Babylon was not a city in the first century when the book of Revelation was written. Babylon had been gone for 6 centuries. There was no Babylon, but it existed in the Jewish memory. I bet it exists in your memory. Do you remember that in 587, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians marched on Jerusalem, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple, plundered the temple, burned it to the ground, and took the Jewish people into exile? Therefore, Babylon in the Jewish consciousness became symbolic as the epitome of all things evil and dark in the world. Here, John is not talking about Babylon, he's talking about Rome, a city which sits on 7 hills. You might have heard that in the text I just read. He's talking about Rome. But it's Rome that embodies the values and the way of life of Babylon. Oppression, destruction, control. And so, in chapter 17, John introduces us to Babylon, or Rome. Not only is she a prostitute, she's the mother of all prostitutes. Babylon is the sort of culture where love where lust masquerades as love, where people were seen as means to an end rather than ends in and of themselves, where deep relationships gave way to shallow business transactions. Babylon was the kind of place where everything had its price tag, even people. And brothers and sisters, there are some things in this world that are cheapened the moment you put a price tag on them, regardless of what the price tag says. People were expendable in this culture. They were used depending on what favors they could provide for you or for the empire. The funny thing about this prostitute is that from a distance, she does not look like a prostitute. From a distance, she looks like a very classy lady. She's dressed in purple, regal garb, and she's wearing pearls around her neck. She looks like a classy lady. But when you get closer to her, you see her for what she is, a prostitute. Likewise, from a distance, the Roman Empire looked like the good life, untold wealth, unfathomable security. The Roman Empire proclaimed peace, the Pax Romana, having rid the world of the Babylonian hordes, having gotten rid of the pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. They opened up trade routes. By the way, think about that word, Mediterranean. You ever thought about that word? Meta, middle, Terranean, earth, world. The Mediterranean was in the middle of the world. But that only makes sense if you see the world through the lens of what? The Roman Empire, right? It's not in the middle of the world. But it is if the Roman Empire is your world. And it was. Babylon has crawled into bed with the powers that be, wealth, prestige, and she's turned people into commodities that can be measured by what they do and what they offer for other people. She is known for immorality and bloodshed. Life is cheap in this culture. There's nothing sacred about it. And eventually, because she walked in ways of death, she died. The city of Babylon was defeated. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And it's kind of funny as they talk about the funeral of Babylon. Only two groups of people come to Babylon's funeral. Did you notice who they were? Kings. Those who received power from her power. The kings came to her funeral. And wealthy merchants came to her funeral. Those who got rich off of the system. You see, friends, people will support all sorts of things. People will crawl in bed with all sorts of things, as long as it increases their power or deepens their pockets. And John writes to his readers, come out of her, come out of Babylon. Which it couldn't be true in a literal sense. She didn't exist. He's talking in a metaphorical sense. Come out of her. Do not live in those ways. And then John saw a new city descending from heaven to earth, a new Jerusalem, a bride descending from heaven, solely devoted to her husband, chaste and singular in her allegiances. In this new Jerusalem, there is no sea, no more chaos. The foes of God have been vanquished. And God dwells in the center of this city, not out there somewhere, not up there somewhere. God is in the midst of her. And in this pervasive presence of God, pain is shared. In fact, God wipes away every tear from our eyes. And there is no more death or mourning or crying or pain. John hears God speak for the second time in the book, behold, I am making all things new. This isn't the same old world we've always known. This is urban renewal at the hand of God. There is a spring in the midst of this city. Not a spring of blood, but a spring with the waters of life, nourishing all that it touches. And the gates. Did you notice the gates of this city? Gates on every side are opened and they are never closed. This is a city which is for all people. This is a place for inclusion. All people have a place in this city. and there is no temple. Surprising, isn't it? Jerusalem was known for the temple. In this Jerusalem, there is no temple. There is no sacred space. It's not because there is no sacred space. It's because everything is sacred space. There is no profane space. Everything is sacred. In the New Jerusalem, there is no light. No sun, no moon, no stars, no night lights, because God is light enough, and there is a river of the water of life, beside which grows the tree of life, whose leaves heal all the nations. This New Jerusalem isn't about an ethnic identity. This is a place for all the nations. There is healing for all the nations. If you didn't know better, you would think this is a retelling of the Garden of Eden. The rivers, the tree of life, the leaves, the fruit. It's almost like we've come full circle and we're ending where we began. And finally, in this city, all people see the face of God. This is a place of community where people are seen as they are, where God is seen as God is. And so we have a tale of two cities. But I've been wondering, do people shape cities, or do cities shape people? It's true that people live in places, but is it not also true that places live in people? Do you remember when the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt? Do you remember that story? Pharaoh had turned them into nothing more than slaves, living tools. They weren't people. Their life's worth was measured in what they could accomplish, their brick quota for the day. Their future was non-existent. They weren't a people. They couldn't be a people. Their identity had been absorbed by the Egyptian empire. They were numbers, not people. Even their children were expendable. Pharaoh was killing them, you might remember. And all of this was doable because Pharaoh was seen as the ultimate authority, divine in and of himself. In fact, you can see the Egyptian sun god's name in the name of Pharaoh. Ra was the Egyptian sun god. Can you see that in the name Pharaoh? He's God. And yet, the strangest thing happened to these people who had no life and no hope and no future. The strangest thing happened. God heard their cries and set about to deliver them. God confronted Pharaoh, a showdown of powers, and God, using what seemed like every facet of creation, reduced the Egyptian empire to nothing and miraculously delivered the people from their bondage in Egypt. God led them from a land of slavery to a land of milk and honey, plenty and goodness. God delivered them out of Egypt. And the story could end there. Celebration, freedom, liberation. That's a great place to end the story, but that's not where the story ends. God also gives them a covenant and a law to shape them as people. And God would say to them, don't forget Egypt. Remember Egypt. Do not forget what life was like in Egypt. Do you remember how it felt for your life to be reduced to your job? That's why I'm giving you the Sabbath. It's a day to rest, and it's a day to be reminded that you are a human being, not a human doing. So rest and remember that being human is more than having a job. And do you remember in Egypt when you were slaves and you were aliens and you were strangers? Do you remember that? Then when you see a stranger or an alien or an immigrant, you remember Egypt. Do not forget Egypt. And do you remember when the political power in Egypt thought he was ultimate? Remember that in your own politics. There is no God other than God. Remember Egypt. You see, brothers and sisters, God did not just want to get the Jewish people out of Egypt. God wanted to get Egypt out of the Jewish people. It would be possible for the Israelites to be freed from Egypt and travel miraculously all the way to the Promised Land, only to rebuild another Egypt of their own doing. God says, no, come out of her. Nelson Mandela, on the day he was freed, Robben Isle, after many years of exile there, says a most amazing thing, and I quote, "As I walked out the door to that gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." Can I read that again? As I walked out the door to the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. Deliverance, liberation, isn't just about changing the context around people, it's about changing people. And it's in this way that we need to recognize the dialectic and mutual relationship between people and their cultures. A place and its people. Is it a place that shapes people, or is it a people that shapes a place? Do cultures produce people, or do people produce cultures? In our day, we often complain about the media. They're liars. They don't tell the truth. Oftentimes what we mean by that is what they're saying doesn't agree with my narrative of how the world works. But can I say to you, we are the culture that absorbs what the media tells us uncritically, and then we turn around and complain about it. We are the one who pass on untruths and half-truths and flat-out lies by spreading untruths by what we say or clicking a button on Facebook. If we're spreading lies and untruths on Facebook, what right do we have to talk about the media? We complain about the violence of our culture. But we are the ones that absorb the violence in our culture. We are the ones who watch television shows and movies where 150 people die violently and we don't think twice about it. But what does that do to our subconscious? What does that do to us as a people and how we understand violence in our culture? We complain about the sexual excess of our culture. And yet all too often we are the ones that participate in arts and music which cheapen human beings, dehumanize women, and hurt all people. We complain about politics, and I'm chief amongst them. And yet, in a democracy, we are the politics. We complain about the ignorance of our culture. All the while, we're devaluing education and the things that make for a good education. I guess what I'm saying is this, brothers and sisters. We shape our culture as much as our culture shapes us. And we complain about being in Egypt, but are blind to the ways in which Egypt lives in us. Geographically speaking, the 7 churches of Asia Minor were between Rome to the west and Jerusalem to the east. The 7 cities were between Rome, Babylon, and Jerusalem. But that isn't just true in a geographical sense. It's true in an ideological sense too. They were between these 2 cities, and frankly, so are we. And we must choose between them. It's as if this text is saying to us today, choose you this day where you will live. Rodney Stark, in that book, The Rise of Christianity, he goes on at the end of his book to say the reason Christianity grew in the earliest centuries from a sociological perspective is all of those urban problems that caused other people to run away, Christians ran towards. When a disease began to spread in a city and everyone fled, Christians said, "We're here, how can we help?" When there was ethnic conflict and strife, Christians were the ones who came in and said, "Your identity, your deepest identity, is not about where you were born, but about the God who bore you." When the earliest cities were overrun by people living in destitution and poverty, the earliest Christians opened the doors, the gates east, north, south, and west, and said, "Come on in. How can we take care of you?" The earliest Christians brought the New Jerusalem into their cities. Can you imagine how powerful it would be if that were to happen today? Can you imagine how powerful it would be if people could discover a little Jerusalem in their own cities today? What would happen if the reality of God could be experienced in the here and now? Not just in those old stories in the Bible about a God who used to do amazing things, or in the future when we all get to heaven, but right now. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what would happen if there was a place where all people were valued, not by their net worth, not by the job to which they attended every single day, but where they were valued because they were created and bore a strange resemblance to the living God? Can you imagine what would happen if there was a place where the doors were open to one and all? A place that provided a sense of belonging to one and all. Not just Republicans or Democrats, because there's a higher agenda than that. Not just liberals or conservatives, because there's a higher agenda than that. Not just rich or poor, or young or old, or black or white, because there are higher agendas than that. Can you imagine a place where the categories that divided people wilted in the light of the amazing God who loves us all? Can you imagine a place where tears were wiped from each other's eyes and were shared in prayer and love and broccoli casseroles? Can you imagine a place where life was cherished and celebrated along with the things that make for life, and the things that make for death were denounced? Can you imagine a place where righteousness dictated our economics and not the other way around? Can you imagine a place where the people were ultimately devoted to God and God alone, who was at the center of it all, and no one's first question was, "What's in it for me?" Can you imagine a place where God's truth was the light of our path and the lamp unto our feet, where people could heal from the wounds of life? Can you imagine? Can you imagine a place where people really believed that newness and transformation was a real possibility in this world? Because nothing is impossible with God. Can you imagine a place where there is no sea, no more chaos or darkness or despair? A place where God's love is palpably present. Can you imagine a place where God is all and in all? Can you imagine? For some people, this place is heaven. In the church I grew up in, it was heaven. We talked about heaven a lot. We sang about heaven. Golden streets and glassy seas and pearly gates. What we'd say to God, St. Peter, when we got to the gate. How many jokes started, St. Peter came to the pearly gates. We talked about heaven. We thought this was heaven. But that's not exactly it here, is it? We're not talking about places. We're talking about ways of life. And this New Jerusalem is not in the heavens where souls flutter up and populate. The New Jerusalem descends very much to the earth. God's will, as Jesus taught us to pray, is done on earth as it is in heaven. What do we call this place? Some people call it heaven. It goes by different names. Some people call it the kingdom of God. Some people call it utopia. Some people will call this impossible. I dream of the day when the people around here call this church. Better yet, I dream of the day that when people stand up to read from their Bibles, Revelation 21, of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven to earth, that people in Little Rock say, "You know, that place sounds an awful lot like this one." That's my dream. I bet it's not too far from your dream. I think it's because it's not too far from God's dream. So let us go and pray and work and live so that God's dreams and our dreams won't just be dreams. And we won't have to wait for heaven to see it. Thanks be to God. Oh Lord, help us to choose our cities wisely. Help us to be a people who live courageously and yet humbly. A people who open up doors for one and all. A place where love is the greatest good. Help us to live in such a way that heaven is coming to earth. Because it is. And help us to live into your future today. We pray this in the name of Jesus, who is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the one who is at the center of it all.